This day, 1216 years ago, Charlemagne was crowned the emperor of the revived Roman Empire by the Pope in the city of Rome. I bet this isn't what you expected when I said I was making a Christmas special, but since I've run out of Santa-related timelines, I thought it would be witty if I made a timeline honoring the anniversary of Christmas rather than the holiday. For the North Americans who make up the vast majority of my audience, many of you are probably wondering why I'm making a timeline about some continental king who lived over 1,000 years ago and conquered nations that no longer exist. The big reason is that Charlemagne effectively created modern Europe, being called both the father of Germany and France, and helping fund a revival in literacy and science. He expanded his Frankish kingdom to encompass most of Western Europe. Also, the lots of little things that would make up this timeline. So, what if Charlemagne never existed? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. In this timeline, Charlemagne is never born or dies as a child of disease. As was mentioned earlier, Charlemagne triggered the Carolingian Renaissance in science and literacy. This was mainly achieved by moving continental scholars from the British Isles, who at the time was the intellectual and monastic capital of Europe, onto continental Europe. Not much would probably be different without it, honestly. After his death, a lot of the Carolingian Renaissance stagnated and didn't really go anywhere or went into decline. Even without it, the Vikings improving trade, the Crusades improved farming methods leading to greater wealth and thus trade, would still move ideas and technology around. Technology would likely be slightly worse in this timeline, the only major difference being that the intellectual and monastic capital of Europe would remain lodged in the British Isles for a few centuries longer. France and Germany would still exist in this timeline. Both cultures were already developing before Charlemagne, with Germanic and Romance cultures mixing to make French culture and Germanic tribal cultures combining to make German culture. The Franks had a system of succession in which different sons were given different slices of their father's kingdom after his death. These divisions were almost always made between the French and German halves of the empire, and at one point it would have split. In conquests, Charlemagne was a magnificent king. He conquered Bavaria, Catalonia, Saxony, eastern Brittany, and most of Italy. A single one of these conquests would have required a great king, but Charlemagne was able to manage them all. Heck, most medieval kings of large countries struggled to maintain their domains they inherited at birth. Some of these conquests were easier than others, but we cannot simply assume that without Charlemagne, his conquests would still have happened. Charlemagne also conquered the northeast of Spain called Catalonia from the Muslims who controlled it at the time. This would honestly not have much effect on history. With the collapse of the Umayyad Caliphate in the 11th century, a power vacuum would exist that the Duke of Toulouse would probably fill, or whatever replacement South French noble we have in this timeline. The only difference I would see is that with the head start, Castile would be larger. We can safely assume that the Conquest of Bavaria would still have happened. The Conquest of Bavaria was easily Charlemagne's easiest, not requiring any military force at all. Also, I don't mean to offend any Germans here, but the Bavarians were not what you call the mightiest and most martial German tribes, and so it's safe to assume that a conquest would still have happened. Saxony, meanwhile, is the opposite. Charlemagne was a military genius, and it took him 30 years of almost constant campaigning to crush the Saxons. In short, if Charlemagne never conquered Saxony, no one else would. The best way to describe the pre-Charlemagne Saxons is as southern Vikings. They had very strong cultural and trade ties with Scandinavia, especially Denmark, and worshipped the same gods such as Thor and Odin as the Scandinavians. The ties were so close that when Charlemagne conquered Saxony, the Danes declared war on the Franks. In our timeline, thousands of Saxons had to be killed in extremely bloody and extended uprisings for the region to be converted to Christianity. However, the region would still likely convert to Christianity in this timeline. During this time period, almost all of Europe converted to Christianity. This was for a variety of reasons, including divine right made unity easier, axial age religions normally defeat pre-axial age religions in religious wars, and it creates trade and diplomatic ties with the rest of Europe. During the time of Charlemagne and for around 100 years afterwards, the Scandinavian countries were equally anti-Christian, with Christian converts often being killed. However, over several hundred years of missionaries, their opinions softened to the point where many 10th century Icelanders felt that Christianity was inevitable and that the old gods were dying. In our timeline, Saxony was a major outpost in the conversion of Scandinavia, and the bishopric of Bremen-Hamburg was instrumental in the conversion of Scandinavia, and so in this timeline, Scandinavia would take longer to convert. The Saxons would not participate in the raiding and conquest of the Viking Age, with it almost entirely being a navigatory movement, and the Saxons not really having a large coast. Having a Scandinavian kingdom in northern Germany would completely change northeastern European history. When the Germanic peoples would migrate east into the Slavic lands later on in the Middle Ages, it would be a mainly Scandinavian, not German movement. This would mean that later on in German history, Prussia would not be German, but Saxon, and that the Teutonic Knights would probably be Scandinavian. To the south, Charlemagne conquered the centuries-old kingdom of the Lombards in northern Italy. Eventually, out of it came the unstable Frankish kingdom of Italy, which collapsed into anarchy. If Charlemagne never conquered the Lombards, northern Italy would probably have remained united. This would have completely changed the history of Italy. The Italian city-state system evolved because there was no unifying force. If we see where similar wealthy strings of city-states developed in medieval Europe, the Netherlands, the Baltic coast of Germany, and northern Italy, they all share that there was no central force to tax, place lords on, and control them. In this timeline, northern Italy would be a united kingdom, but there would be no great city-states like Venice, Genoa, Milan, or Verona, and the Renaissance would be very different and less centered on Italy. In our timeline, the Venetians used the Crusaders to destroy the Byzantine Empire during the Fourth Crusade instead of sending them to the Holy Land, since they competed for trade and power in the eastern Mediterranean with the Byzantines. Without the Italian city-states existing, this would not happen, and the Byzantines would have remained a Balkan power. The collapse of the Byzantine Empire in the early 13th century led to a power vacuum in which the Ottomans entered and became a world power in. If this never happened, the Turks would never have entered Europe, and they would have remained a purely Middle Eastern empire. When Charlemagne was in Italy, he created the Papal States, which was basically a private kingdom for the Pope in central Italy that survived into the 19th century. He carved this land out of the defeated Lombard kingdom, and so without him, the papacy would be much weaker. The Lombards and the papacy would inevitably struggle over control over Italy, similarly to the German emperors and the papacy in our timeline. After much conflict, the Lombards would likely be able to defeat the papacy by crude physical force, with the Pope's authority being limited to the city of Rome, and without the North Italian allies that saved him in our timeline from the German emperors. The Pope would likely flee Rome to prevent from becoming a Lombard puppet to somewhere in France. However, this would likely not last forever due to the sheer cultural importance of Rome. At some point, the political situation would change, and the Pope would likely return to Rome. This isn't that different than the 14th century, when the Pope left Rome for the city of Avignon in France, because the politics of Rome simply got too stifling. Since Charlemagne bailed out the Pope from Roman mobs and gave him the Papal States, the Pope made Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor. The title was preserved into the early 19th century, even though it never really fulfilled its title, either being disunited, at war with the Pope, and thus not holy, and it was never really Roman, with it mainly being German. It's honestly pretty hard to say how Europe would be different without the Holy Roman Empire. Firstly, with Saxony effectively being South Scandinavia, the Saxon monarchs who recreated the Holy Roman Empire and reunited Germany in the 10th century never would have existed. Besides this, Germany would have united earlier. The Holy Roman Empire was quite possibly the strangest nation in Europe. There was an emperor who was later on always an Austrian Habsburg, but he was almost never had power beyond Austria and Bohemia. He, however, was treated as a true monarch by the courts of Europe, and so he could get into political alliances and marriages to get him enough power to prevent anyone else from uniting Germany. Also, he could always play the divine right card, meaning he would always have a certain number of vassals who would follow him in crushing anyone who would try to unite the empire. However, he never had the power to ever unite the empire, because whenever he would try, the duchies would ally against him. In this timeline, without the imperial facade and without northern Germany making things more complicated, Germany would likely be united earlier, probably by the Bavarians. This would have many major effects on German history. Firstly, with them united earlier, they could get better colonies in the colonial race of the 19th century, not being left with the table scraps from Britain and France. Also, without being led by the highly militaristic Prussians, Europe would probably be a much more peaceful and tepid continent in the 20th century, or whatever this timeline's equivalent is. Finally, a victory Charlemagne made that was not a conquest, it was a defeat of the Avars. The Avars were a nomadic people who lived in what is now Hungary, but was then called Pannonia by Western Europeans, and for the sake of this timeline and anachronism, let's call Pannonia in this video. The Avars were fabulously wealthy, and due to some raiding an Avar settlement in contested land, Charlemagne invaded. Charlemagne smashed the amazing Avar defenses called the Ring and basically committed genocide against the Avars. This led to a vacuum in which the Magyars, or modern-day Hungarians, could enter the region. Without the destruction of the Avars, the Magyars never would have entered the region. As said earlier, the region was very well defended, and if Charlemagne did not conquer it, the Magyars wouldn't have. The Magyars would have remained in the Ukrainian steppe, probably being crushed and assimilated by the Pechenegs a few hundred years later. The best way to compare the Avars and the Magyars is to think of the Austrians and Prussians. The Avars had lived in the Pannonian Plain for hundreds of years, and had settled down to a fairly peaceful, by nomad standards, existence. Meanwhile, the second the Magyars entered the Pannonian Plain, they raided deep into Western Europe. In our timeline, the Hungarians have typically been thought of as the worst by their neighbors, mainly because when they were global hegemons, they treated all their neighboring peoples like garbage. There are two ways an Avar Hungary could play out. Since they would be less aggressive, they would have less chance of being a power than the Hungarians, but if they did, they would probably have a larger and more successful empire, because they would be better at running it than the Hungarians. A weaker Hungary/Pannonia might have resulted in the Croatians becoming a medieval nation-state without hundreds of years of Hungarian oppression. Maybe the Croatians would have become an Adriatic power. What if Altist? Thank you for watching. And for the Charlemagne fans out there, I'm sorry, but Charlemagne is just such an epic life, and is such a larger-than-life figure, that it's impossible for me to put every single part of his life and his achievements in this video, and I had to take out some parts that were irrelevant to the flow of this alternate history, like his civil reforms. But, thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next video. Thank you.